some issues that I was facing in malware analysis and thinking about malware analysis education. Sort of some reflections from being in malware analysis for about 5-6 years now. I usually don't love agenda slides because I feel like it kind of spoils the surprise, but I figure if I bomb, it would be good to know when it's almost over. So these are kind of the topics that we're going to be covering. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the talk motivation just because I feel like it's a good idea to kind of frame how we're approaching the educational aspects of malware analysis and how we're kind of transferring knowledge to the next generation of malware analysts. But I'm going to go through some of the tools that I think people should be aware of. Some of you might be aware of them if you've done malware analysis before. But yeah, we're going to go through some tools, talk about some of the challenges, and then I'm going to have a couple of thoughts and findings about what to do next. So slides a little bit about me. I currently work at SentinelOne. If you haven't heard of it, we have an EDR product. We have a whole bunch of other products, but mainly what we do on the DFIR team is that we respond to incidents at enterprise customers of a certain size. We also take on pro bono cases for nonprofits and non-governmental organizations. So there's a lot of interesting stories from doing incident response there. I've been working as an incident responder on that team for the past 2 years, and now kind of transitioning more to a role working on forensic tools and automation. If you've heard of the Dissect framework by the folks at Foxit NCC Group, we've been using things like that a lot and trying to kind of make our own tools more flexible. I have a lot of background in malware, so I mainly have been supporting the team by analyzing any malware we come across. And so there have been some interesting developments since joining SentinelOne. The type of malware that you come across there might be trying to tamper with EDR, might be using vulnerable drivers. So it's been different from other places that I've worked at, other places you can see on this slide. Got some certifications. I always put the GCFE first. I feel like I'm a forensic investigator at heart, and that Forensic 500 class by SANS, taught by Rob Lee, was definitely what kind of drew me into this line of work. And there's a little bit of trivia about me. I live in Boston now. But yeah, we'll continue. So the motivation for this talk, it's something that I've been thinking about for a while. First, I think we should pay homage to these two books and their authors, just because as far as milestones of malware analysis education, they're still kind of like cornerstone books in the ways that people get into malware analysis. The first book you might read is Practical Malware Analysis. And I think Malware Analyst Cookbook and DVD, it came out in 2010, I believe, and Practical Malware Analysis came out in 2012. I think the Cookbook and DVD book gets a little bit less attention from beginners because it's a little bit more daunting. You work with more Python, you get into more scripting, but it serves as kind of like a very important framework for how I think we should be teaching and proceeding to teach things like malware analysis or forensics, for example. Practical Malware Analysis is a great book. It's an amazing book. A lot of the exercises, you're using a lot of different tools. You might be using RegShot to capture changes in the registry. You might be using auto runs to find a bunch of different persistence mechanisms that malware can have. You might be using something really cool like Procmon to study all kinds of behaviors, but you're opening up a bunch of different tools and they're all very graphical. They're all very click around your Windows screen. And on the other hand, Malware Analyst Cookbook and DVD is very much, you're writing Python, you're working with frameworks, and you're modifying your tools to work to fit the challenges that you're facing in that book. So the difficulty is that, when you start learning on a Windows system with a GUI-based tool, it's kind of hard to break out of that mindset. So a lot of us, if we're doing malware analysis professionally, might be using IDA Pro, we might be using Binary Ninja, and being able to smoothly transition between something that you do in that tool and something that you're programming that's flexible, that suits your own purpose, is something that I think should be part of the education process. So I think some of the tools that I'm going to talk about in this presentation, some of you might know, some of them are fairly old. Some of them are from 2012, some of them are from the early 2000s. But I feel like a lot of people who are getting into the industry might not know about them. They might just be stuck with the tools that they know about or that their mentor taught to them. And there's some other things on this slide about the current state of education for malware analysts, and I think we should be trying to improve that and trying to enshrine a place where people can learn reverse engineering, malware analysis, and all kinds of topics. I always support open security training. They have a fantastic set of video courses for beginners, and whenever I put together a curriculum for one of our interns to start learning, I always reference their courses on assembly and their older courses on reverse engineering. But I wanted to kind of clarify, there are different types of asks that if you're working in malware analysis professionally, there's different things that people will ask you to do, especially if you're doing, as I'm doing, supporting incident response. You might just be asked for indicators of compromise, indicators that the malware has run, so that might be IP addresses, it might be persistence mechanisms, it might be processes that are injected. Now, these kinds of things you can typically get from a sandbox if it's configured well. You run the malware in a sandbox and out comes this information. In the second case, where you have to do more behavioral inspection, it might be that the malware is detecting that it's in a sandbox, and so it's not executing properly. And so you have to take a closer look at it to see what it is detecting or what it's avoiding. It could also be that the sample is only designed to execute on certain computers, certain targets, or it's designed to execute on a specific domain. So it might check, if you're targeting a school, it might check to see that if the computer is attached to the school's domain. So there's all kinds of things that you can look into from a behavioral inspection perspective. And then the capability analysis is the third thing. It's kind of like the highest tier of malware analysis, but it can be kind of difficult depending on how much insight you have into the malware. And it's typically something where you do have to open up a disassembler and a decompiler to sort of study all the different functions, because not all the capabilities will be necessarily revealed by executing the malware. There might be things that it's got to check in and receive a particular response to do. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm kind of focusing on behavioral inspection because I feel like it's one of the best ways to learn quickly about the thing that you're studying. Capability analysis is something, you just have to learn reverse engineering, and in a sense, you have to learn some of the techniques. There's sometimes pattern recognition of different encryption algorithms. And so that's something that just takes time. And I feel like there are some fantastic tools that are doing work on being able to see capabilities at a glance. So there's a tool called CAPA. It's written by Mandiant. And you run this tool, and it basically scans code for certain patterns of APIs or certain constants that are common to encryption algorithms, and it can kind of tell you, oh, this is using RC4, or this might have networking capability. So there are some great tools there, but they typically take a little bit more time to understand. So getting into behavioral inspection, I think if you're evaluating a tool for being able to do behavioral inspection, you need three things. The first thing you need is for it to comprehensively see all the system interactions between the malware and the operating system. So you want as much coverage as you can of all of the API calls and system calls, and you want to be able to monitor all of this functionality to make sure you don't miss anything. Because if you're doing behavioral inspection, you basically don't want to miss anything, and so you want to do it at the lowest level possible. File type support, this is something that's an interesting research area for me because malware is delivered in a bunch of different ways. A lot of malware analysis is focused on the EXEs and the DLLs, which are in the portable executable format. But there's a lot of different ways to deliver malware, including through installers. That's kind of an interesting research area for me because there are special types of installers that can basically include code that will do sandbox detection or that will prevent the malware from running further. I've run into a couple of those lately. So file type support can be important just because, if your tool doesn't support looking at this type of file, you're going to have to go download another tool. You're going to have to take another approach. Whereas if you have something that is basically mimicking whatever operating system that you're using well enough that it can handle any file that operating system would execute, then you have a more comprehensive solution. And then customizability, it becomes kind of important with the kind of top 20% or the top 10% maybe of malware, where they're specifically trying to evade sandboxes. They specifically know what they're looking for. Customizability, a couple examples are, you might have some malware that's checking to see how much memory you have on your system. And if you have an enterprise sandbox, and we have enterprise sandboxes that we use, so I won't name any names, but if you have a sandbox where your virtual machine, or the virtual machine that detonates the sample is allocated 4 gigabytes of memory, I guess you can get on the phone with support and say, hey, can you increase my memory to 8 gigabytes for this hypervisor? But they might not do that for you. Whereas if you have your own sandbox and you're able to customize what it's reporting as the amount of memory it has, then you can change that. And whatever malware is looking for, specifically over 4 gigabytes of memory on the system, will actually execute. And that's from experience. But so I wanted to talk about a couple of inspection tools that I've been trying out. Some of these may be familiar to people. First, I wanted to cover a couple terms because I realized that I used them a lot in the presentation, and so I should define them. So emulation or emulators, you might be familiar with this term from games, emulating, video game systems, maybe on your PC or another device, is basically the ability to imitate another program or device. So there's different types of emulation we're going to be talking about, but basically we want to fake there being an operating system. So we provide responses to the malware as if we have an operating system there when we don't actually have one there. And so we're not executing code, which makes it safer and more easy to reset if you're going through the process of malware analysis. There's also dynamic binary instrumentation, basically the process of being able to modify a program's instructions as it's executing. Now, this can be really useful if you're trying to basically remove any obstacles to your analysis on the fly, or you're trying to remove detections, or you're just trying to monitor the behavior at a very deep level. So here are a couple of the big names in both the emulation space over here on the left and the dynamic binary instrumentation space on the right. Another thing you'll notice is that a lot of the emulation frameworks that I've put here on the left, they actually expose Python APIs, so you can go play with them if you're familiar with Python and just kind of like see their limitations and capabilities. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time working with all of these, and so I'll let you know a bit of my opinion on some of them. But I would say that the longer you spend just kind of working with these tools and seeing how far can you emulate a Windows user mode executable, how far can you go with one of the tracing frameworks. You might need to install symbols and things, so give yourself some time and space to play with these a bit. But my feelings after working with a bunch of these tools, I think Chilling was the first one that I looked at, and I had kind of high hopes for it because it works on Windows, Linux, and UEFI and like various other binaries, and so it can emulate a bunch of different operating systems. However, the Windows support is not really as far as you want it to be. You can't typically execute a complex binary all the way through. Speakeasy, it's a framework developed by folks at Mandiant. It's fantastic for shellcode, and it does successfully emulate some binaries all the way through. But what I've found in general is that if you're trying to use an emulation framework, it's best to use it to emulate a specific function. If you have a piece of malware and you're not really sure what encryption algorithm is being used, but you can see that encrypted data goes in and then decrypted data comes out. A nice thing you can do with emulation is that you can just take that piece of code and just use it portably. So you don't actually have to know what encryption algorithm is being used. You can just use it to decrypt. As long as the malware author just keeps using that algorithm, you can just keep using it without even knowing what's going on in there. Which is kind of fun because otherwise you can spend a bunch of time trying to figure out if they've written their own custom implementation of some common algorithm. But emulation does have other uses, and I do still have hopes for it. On the dynamic instrumentation side of things, DynamoRio or DR Memory, as you might find their product, it's a very old tool actually, and it does fairly well with instrumenting and tracing syscalls. One caveat I will say is that if you use it's very easy to install. They just have like a setup installer. One caveat that I will mention is that it will constantly ask you for symbols. So it will want to reach out to the internet to download symbols so that it can properly trace the executables. And that's a bit annoying. So I would say try to get your own symbols before you start running malware because it'll ask you to connect to the internet. And there are a couple other tools here. One of my coworkers, his name is Adam, he uses Frida for a lot of different tracing projects. And I think going forward, I'm definitely going to give Frida like a closer look because first of all, it's kind of weird because you have to write JavaScript for it. You basically inject programs with JavaScript. And it seems like it shouldn't work, but he's written monitors for all kinds of things. He actually can trace, I think the last thing he worked on was VB script. So like the W script executable, if you're executing like a VB script, you can actually, if you just reverse the W script executable a bit, you can find points at which you can basically hook some functions within it to deobfuscate scripts. And I think that's a really interesting research area because a lot of people are trying to deobfuscate things like JavaScript or VB script statically. But if you're able to kind of instrument using a framework like this, and I'm thinking like W script and also msiexec.exe, which installs Windows installers, goes back to what I was saying before. You've got some installers that are especially unfriendly to sandboxes. So I think working with these dynamic instrumentation frameworks can have a lot of payoff in the near future. But I wanted to just talk about a little bit of the limitations of some of the frameworks. I kind of already spoke about this, but using the graph that we had before, what I was kind of seeing was that emulation, it's very customizable because a lot of the emulation frameworks I just talked about, they're written in Python, and so you can straight up change the configuration very easily. It might be in a text file, how much memory you're saying that you have. So you can change things really easily. The issue is that a lot of the system calls and Windows API calls are not implemented in a lot of these frameworks, and so you'll need to do a lot of work if you come across, and I'll have a screenshot later, but if you're trying to execute an entire binary, basically you have to fake every Windows API call. And some of these frameworks get past that very high bar, or the very high amount of code you need to write to cover all of those API calls. They get past it in different ways, but it's definitely limited how much operating system interactions you're able to get out of an emulation framework. It's mainly really good for shellcode, which is written typically as position independent, like assembly code. So it doesn't have necessarily a lot of API calls. Emulation is really good for shellcode, not so great for complete binaries. Dynamic instrumentation is really good at getting system interactions, and it's very customizable, but the file type support, typically it's really focused on executables and DLLs. And then enterprise sandboxes, they have amazing file type support, and they a lot of the ones that are based on hypervisors or virtual machines, they're monitoring everything, so they get a lot of the system interactions. They're just not customizable because they belong to whatever company. And so when things happen, like malware comes around that's checking graphics cards and seeing if you're in a sandbox there, or they're checking the name of your CPU, that's not something that you can easily change if you're working with an enterprise sandbox. So they're not customizable enough to where they hold up against the newest samples. So you kind of have to wait for that company to figure out, or you have to report it to them. And when it's an incident response, I just want the sample to work. Like, I want the sample to execute so I can move on with things. I don't want to send an email to our sandbox provider. So I think, although you might have seen this coming, malleable sandboxes, like a sandbox you can control, is probably for a production environment the most ideal. Now, it may not sound ideal to run your own sandbox on premise, especially if you take in a large volume of samples. But I think you should have at least one, and you should be comfortable playing with a sandbox and making every sample you can work well. I think if I were teaching a class about evasive malware, I would, the whole point of the class would be to harden your sandbox to the point where you can run everything that I throw at you, like in the class. So a couple examples of malleable sandboxes. Cape v2, been around for a while. It's a very good, it's pretty robust framework. It does take a bit of involvement to set up, but they've made that process kind of easy for you. And I'll have links for all of the tools that I mention at the end. And then Drakvuf Sandbox, I don't actually know how I'm supposed to pronounce that one, but that's written by the folks at Cert Polska. I couldn't actually find an icon for it, so I just put the Cert Polska icon. But it's a tool that I've been hearing a lot about lately. They are a sandbox framework. They're highly modifiable. And Cert Polska also has written a bunch of things that are helpful for automated unpacking. So if you have packed malware or configuration extraction. So fantastic tool that I'm going to be trying to work with more. But these are two that I recommend checking out. If you've been putting it off till today because it's going to be a lot of work, you should still do it. So with all that in mind, this is what kind of an ideal malware analysis pipeline would look like. Well, first, you always have to triage the files. You'll run into all kinds of situations with malware, especially in incident response. You want to make sure that you've gotten all the files that you need to successfully execute the sample. Sometimes the file that you execute is not the one with the malicious code in it. Could be in another DLL. Could be an encrypted shellcode file somewhere else on the disk. So it's important to have that context. If you work at an antivirus company or an EDR company, you're more likely to have the context of exactly how it executed and with what command line arguments. But if you don't, you'll have to go in and maybe reverse engineer it a bit to figure out how you're supposed to get it to run. But once that's done, Ideally, and at scale, you might have unpacking done statically, so you don't have to detonate the whole malware in a sandbox. When I was at IBM, they have fantastic infrastructure. They have a large team of reverse engineers, and so after you have studied an unpacker, they'd write some Python code to unpack it, and that's very fast. It's as fast as Python can be. And so you may be able to statically unpack it, or you may be able to emulate the unpacking process. For things like UPX, it's pretty easy to use an emulator just to emulate that function that performs the decompression, or to just emulate to the point where it's unpacked and then dump that from memory. This is still a lot faster than running it in a sandbox. And if that is successful, where you statically unpack a known malware family, then you can have written a configuration extractor to get your IOCs out, and all of that should be done in like 30 seconds. So in the case that it isn't a known malware family and emulated unpacking doesn't work, then you're going to want to do sandbox detonation. It's probably the best way of getting IOCs out in that case. And then if things don't work out with your sandbox, you're going to need to dive deeper, probably do behavioral inspection. Because, I mean, there could be a variety of reasons. It could be that it's detecting your sandbox, or it could be that you're missing a component that you didn't know about before. And that will hopefully become clear with the behavioral inspection. And if not, you can also just waste your time reversing and debugging. But sometimes you can't avoid it. So I'll let people take pictures of that. So I kind of wanted to talk about some of the challenges, because I think a lot of us have a habit of opening up every binary that we get in our favorite disassembler and decompiler, and thinking we can just brute force our way through understanding a binary. Times have kind of changed to where these binaries are large enough that you really kind of want to know what you're doing and where you're looking in a binary before you start opening it up. So these are kind of like a couple of those challenges. Go, for example, Golang, the binaries are very large. They statically link a lot of different libraries. And so if you just start clicking around in your decompiler, you might find yourself in library code 90% of the time. So it really helps to get maybe an API log from your sandbox, or a trace log from your dynamic binary instrumentation tool, just to get yourself oriented so that you go through the binary correctly. And so unfriendly compilers, obfuscation, and Rust and unknown compilers can really kind of throw off your normal control flow. If you're familiar with C and C++, usually those things are kind of clear, but we're at a point where the Go compiler and the Rust compilers are changing all the time. And so things that might have worked last year for them might not work this year, if you were familiar with some of those idiosyncrasies. And then, as I was saying, some of these different file types and some of these things that run on interpreters like VBScript or JavaScript or JScript, all of these things are kind of running within executables. And so, if you're up against obfuscation, you don't want to be sitting there statically trying to deobfuscate scripts. And so I think, it'll be good if we focus on getting our sandboxes to introspect into some of these scripts. There's a lot more Python malware out there nowadays using things like PyArmor. And threat actors are getting kind of innovative with chaining the different interpreters together, and putting JavaScript and using putting JavaScript interpreters on their target systems in order to execute JavaScript. And so another thing that's always been a problem is virtualized binaries, VM protect, and various ways of writing virtual machines within binaries so that the assembly that you're looking at is not actually being executed. It's being interpreted by their custom interpreter. And so your skills of reverse engineering are not going to be super useful until you have de-virtualized the sample. And I was at RECon this year. It's a conference for reverse engineers. They were having it in Montreal. And, you've got computer science PhDs there who get to spend a month de-virtualizing a sample, and I do not. Most of us don't get that kind of time. And, even if I did get that kind of time, I don't think I would be able to do it that well. So virtualized binaries are definitely an issue. Now, sometimes they're not fully virtualized, and there are ways to take advantage of the fact that sometimes threat actors don't know how to use the tools that they're using. But this, I'm not going to be talking about those tricks here because, it's maybe kind of illegal to talk about that anyways. Because, these are, VM Protect is a company that sells a legitimate product. So it's hard to even professionalize a tool to get past that for the sake of malware analysis. And, MSI installer, as I already talked about. And then for Linux malware, a kind of a different set of problems just due to the lack of prevalence of Linux malware. It's not like it doesn't exist, but there's definitely a lack of focus on getting really deep into the instrumentation of Linux malware. I found myself last year with a piece of Linux malware, and we were using Evans debugger, it's built into Remnix, if you've heard of that Linux distribution for malware analysis. And so we had this one debugger that we could use for it. And there was some kind of bug in Evans debugger on the Remnix machine to where we couldn't dump the memory. And we didn't, there were some other solutions that we could use, but there weren't very many of them. So you want to be as familiar with your sandbox for Linux as possible if you're going to run into that on the regular. So kind of my conclusions with some of these tools. And some of these, I'm not sure if you can really, you probably can't really read these screenshots, but the one up top is me using chilling, trying to emulate. So this is actually a stager for Sliver. It's implant written in Go. Now this stage up top is actually packed, and so it's unpacking using the virtual alloc API, so it's allocating memory. And you can see that, well, you probably can't see, but virtual alloc X calls basically down to one of the syscalls that's ZW allocate virtual memory. And so none of these are implemented by default in Chiling, and so you can't see the arguments, and it's not going to execute, or it's not going to emulate fully and properly. And that's what you'll run into with most of the emulation frameworks, is that not enough of the APIs are implemented for you to get a complete picture of what's happening in the binary. Now, there's a framework called Dumpulator. It's written by the author of the x64 debug tool, and he's getting around this by focusing on the syscalls, so the very low-level stuff like ZW allocate virtual memory, because if you implement those, it doesn't really matter if the user mode ones don't work. You'll be able to cover more functionality because there's a lot more user mode APIs like virtual alloc X that are exported in kernel 32 than there are system calls. So if you cover the system calls, you'll get a very low level and you'll get a lot more coverage. The only difficulty is that the arguments for those system calls are a bit more complicated, and also the system calls change based on the Windows version. So it's still a very hard problem for emulators to get ahead of. Now below it is actually a trace using GF trace. It stands for Go function trace. It was written by somebody who basically noticed that there was, for Go binaries, a gate that all Windows API calls go through to execute any operating system calls on Windows. And so he basically just hooked this function, and he provides like a default list of APIs that get hooked, but it's not like a ton of code or necessarily a gargantuan effort, but you get all these API calls, and you get, all the way down at the bottom, you can see the command and control address for the sliver implant for the Go binary. So that goes to say that for binary instrumentation, you can get like a lot of value with a lot less work. The only downside is that you are executing the program, and so you've got to reset your VM every time you do this. But it can provide quick solutions to specific problems pretty quickly, and hence me noting that my coworker Adam, using Frida, is able to go from prototyping to tracing various things pretty quickly. So yeah, I mean, emulators, like I said, they're very useful for emulating single functions. You can automate certain things, and that's a lot faster than sandboxing. But at the end of the day, malleable sandboxes and really getting your hands dirty with modifying your sandbox is still what you should be doing at scale. And if we can work on instrumenting those sandboxes so that we can bypass things that malware authors are checking for, I think that that's pushing the needle forward on something that's scalable and something that we can continue to pass down. So these are some of the frameworks that I've been talking about. Highly recommend checking out the sandbox section. I'm going to be looking at Frida definitely a lot more closely, and I've been talking to the developer of Dumpulator about some of the uses that he's developed for Dumpulator, but there's a lot more potential there as far as emulation. So if anybody has any questions or thoughts about any of this stuff, like I said, this knowledge is something that I think people have, but it's difficult to transfer. So I'm just happy to talk about or learn about any new tools that y'all know about as well. So.
Yeah, silly question, but
yeah.
The sandboxes and the emulators, are they free to use for anyone?
Yeah, I think all of these are. Now, there's some enterprise sandboxes, which are very good products. They're managed by companies who keep track of, what malware is doing just like in the wild. And so if you have like an enterprise sandbox, you're going to be paying for that. But all of these that I've talked about are free. So, go ahead.
What is your general opinion on some of those enterprise sandboxes? Like you run their triage or hybrid analysis?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things. First of all, if you're uploading your files to a cloud sandbox, you have to be aware that they might not keep it private. So if it's a sample that's something that you really shouldn't be sharing, you shouldn't upload it there. If you're a company who's having an incident response, it's not a great idea to upload your files to VirusTotal. We see that all the time, but you really shouldn't. But my opinion in general is that they're fantastic tools. I've basically been working with VMRay Sandbox at almost every company I've worked at, and it's a fantastic tool. And they're adding features all the time. Now, however, like I said, companies can move only so fast, and when malware comes out with a new evasion technique, it's not fast enough if you're in an incident response, but it's fantastic. I would say triage is also pretty good. I think they don't give you necessarily the full list of Windows APIs, which I think is something you always need. And the more you do malware analysis, the more you appreciate just getting the Windows APIs, because it tells you all you need to know sometimes.
Do you have any experience with features built in emulator?
I haven't used it specifically. I have been hearing about it. It's definitely something that I'm interested to use, but I think that, from what I've heard, is also something that you would use to emulate specific functions rather than the whole binary.
This might be a bit specific, but what's your tool of choice for de-obfuscating JavaScript?
Oh, yeah. So there are a couple of tools built into Remnix that I like to use, like Box.js. And I think there's DE4.js as well. I think my mentor really liked Malzilla, I think is the name of it. Yeah, I mean, that one's a decent one. Yeah. There's a bunch of good tools out there, but I don't know. It's pretty hit and miss for static deobfuscation. Sure.
Can you share your slide deck?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think legal is going to be giving me any calls over any of this. I put SentinelOne logos on enough. Sure.
Do you have any experience using memory forensics as a tool for the analysis?
Oh yeah, I mean, I do work as an incident responder. We don't get to use memory imaging a lot, and I do wish that we had a decent solution for that. But we do deploy, I mean, we do use dump it or other tools to get memory, and then we do, we use volatility, and I'm also a big fan of, there's a tool that basically allows you to open up the memory image as a file system, so you can just poke around. I forget what the name of it is. Sorry? I don't think it's Mandiant. I think it was developed by Johannes Ulrich. But anyways, yeah, definitely memory forensics is great, and I think obviously SentinelOne runs in memory, and so it'll catch things that run in memory. But sometimes when you're doing forensics and you come to something much later, you have to figure out a way of dumping that memory so you can get the payload. Yeah, cool. All right, thanks.